If we hear the story of Jacob in today's reading by itself, just as we read it today, it's a really beautiful story. It's the story of our hero Jacob, who's traveling and stops for the night in a place with no name. He's camping simply. He's sleeping on the ground outdoors with just a stone for his pillow. And as he sleeps, God visits him in this rich, evocative dream. And Jacob sees a ladder connecting heaven and earth, and all of God's messengers moving up and down the ladder. And this dream seems to confirm for Jacob what he already knew and what we know, that there's this constant communication between heaven and earth, constant contact between heaven and earth. And then God appears next to Jacob. You would think that with that ladder there, Jacob would have to climb up the ladder to get to God, to find some remote God on some distant throne. But no, God comes down and stands next to Jacob and speaks to Jacob. And God knows who Jacob is, and God knows Jacob's story and the story of Jacob's ancestors, knows all about Jacob. And God reaffirms the promises that God made to Jacob's parents, Isaac and Rebekah, and to Jacob's grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, that their descendants were going to be this great nation, that they were going to cover the earth, and that the rest of the world, that all the nations of the world would be blessed through their descendants. He's sort of recapitulating the promises that he's made to this little family. But then God makes an additional promise to Jacob. God promises Jacob, the simple traveler, this guy who's sleeping on the ground in the middle of nowhere, God promises that he will always be with him. God promises that God will bring Jacob back from his travels, and no matter where Jacob travels, that God will be with him. And when he wakes up, Jacob is so overcome by this dream, so overwhelmed by the idea of the presence of God, that he wants to mark this occasion. He wants to mark this place that had no name, this place that was no place. He calls it Bethel, house of God, the place of God. And like hikers and campers have always done, Jacob marks this spot with a standing stone, with a cairn. Sometimes if you're hiking, you'll see little piles of stones that hikers have put up to mark a particular place. And Jacob is marking this place to say, something important happened here. This is not no place. This is an important place. So it's not surprising that followers of Jesus have typically read this story as an allegory of Christ. Christ and his cross as that ladder connecting heaven and earth and making it possible for heaven and earth to be in conversation. Christ and his cross as the means for bringing God down and allowing God to be in intimate conversation, an intimate relationship with us. And Christ and his cross as the means by which God's promises will be fulfilled. By the way, God's promises will be fulfilled through Jacob, who, let's not forget, is later renamed Israel. Through the children of Israel, these promises will be confirmed, and through Israel, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And for Christians to understand, in some cases, Christians will understand this stone that has been anointed, this stone that has had oil poured over it, as Christ founded his church as the house of God, Bethel. Now, of course, this story was already ancient when Mary was telling it to the baby Jesus, and at the telling of it for the 1,000 years up to that point, it made no reference to Christ and was not seen as an allegory of Christ. And for the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people have continued to take solace from this story and continue to understand this story as being about God's promises to the people of God with no reference to Christ. But nonetheless, for us as Christians reading this story, there's a nice resonance there. There's a nice sort of echo there, especially if you read this story by itself. But we need to remember how we got to this point in the story. We need to remember why it is that Jacob is on the road, sleeping on the ground with a rock for a pillow. Last week we heard about Jacob and his twin brother Esau, and how they had been fighting with each other even from the time they were in their mama's belly. And we heard about how Jacob basically extorted Esau into signing over his birthright in exchange for a little bit of food. And in between last week's reading and this morning's reading, we could have read the story of about how Jacob kind of conspires with his mother Rebekah to fool his old, blind, weak father into giving Jacob the blessing that was meant for Esau. I mean, if you know this story, you've probably read this story about how Esau goes out to hunt for game, and Jacob goes to his mother, and his mother prepares goat meat and dresses it up like wild game for him to take in. And because he's worried that he's smooth and his brother Esau is hairy, he puts the skin of the kid over his shoulders and over his hands so that he feels hairy. And he puts on Esau's clothes so that he's going to smell like Esau. And then finally, when his father Isaac said, "Who is it that's there?" he flat out lies and said, "Father, it's Esau, your son." I mean, this isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is Jacob and his mother Rebekah deliberately putting together this elaborate hoax to cheat Esau out of his blessing. Now, we may think of a blessing as a minor thing. You know, okay, you give a blessing, you give another blessing. But in the ancient world, the blessing on the son meant something. It meant what the father was leaving to the son. It meant something that was irrevocable. Isaac couldn't take back the blessing once he had given it, and he couldn't give the same blessing to Esau. This was a real theft. So at the beginning of today's reading, Jacob isn't just traveling through the countryside. Happens to lie down to go to sleep. Jacob is on the run. Jacob is on the lam. Jacob is running from the brother that he just cheated. Jacob is running from the twin brother that has sworn to kill him. Now, we know the end of the story, and we know that Jacob ends up being a pretty good guy, and Jacob ends up founding the house of Israel, and Jacob, comes out all right in the end. But if we had read up to this point, Jacob looks like the evil twin.